For more on this, we'll go now to Nicholas J. Davies, author of the book Blood on Our Hands, The American Invasion and Destruction of Iraq. Nicholas, General Votel at CENTCOM believes that a new influx of American trainers, presumably more special forces, should be made available to help train the Afghan troops escalate the fight. When President Obama left office, we had about 8,000 troops on the ground. Today, we have about double that number. But when Obama took office back in 2009, we had a failed surge with as many as 100,000 soldiers at one point. Why would they think a new surge would change the landscape now?
I really have no idea. As you said, the Taliban controls more of Afghanistan today than it has at any time since 2001, since the U.S. invasion. And these kind of counterinsurgency operations that the U.S. is ramping up only fuel resistance, and that's true whether it's in Afghanistan or Iraq or across Africa or all the places where the U.S. has launched military operations since September the 11th. Effectively, U.S. military operations have created almost a global counterinsurgency across the entire U.S. empire. And the reasons, there are extensive studies now as to why people join these armed groups and resist these foreign invasions. It's not hard to understand.
Now, Nicholas, I'm glad you brought that up. I'm glad that you brought that up and that you called it the U.S. empire, because in your most recent essay, you wrote, quote, the U.S. war on Afghanistan is the longest war in U.S. history. There must be U.S. troops in Afghanistan today whose fathers were fighting there 16 years ago. So put into perspective for us what a multi-generational war does to those who are affected, soldiers, families, and of course the civilians, in this case here in Afghanistan.
Well, there's never been any comprehensive study of how many civilians have really been killed in 17 years of war in Afghanistan, or 16 going on 17. But it's certainly in the hundreds of thousands. And so in these conditions of foreign invasion and occupation and the installation of a hopelessly corrupt government, people end up taking up arms to defend themselves, their families, their villages, their communities, and so ramping up the kind of aggressive counterinsurgency operations that are fueling the resistance and have allowed the Taliban to become the de facto government in half the country once again. This is not a solution. And the Afghan forces that the U.S. is counting on, they only have 21,000 so-called commandos or special forces trained, and they are doing 70 to 80% of the fighting in Afghanistan. You cannot control an entire country with 20,000 commandos, even backed up by 20,000 U.S. troops.
And like you said,
this is a failed policy.
Like you said, 16 plus years later, still the Taliban controls now about half the territory in Afghanistan. At what point do we stop throwing good money after bad or putting more lives on the line? Will this ultimately result, do you think, in a modern-day Vietnam for the Pentagon?
Well, what Admiral Stavridis, who was asked by the Associated Press, said, that the goal is still, supposedly, to bring the Taliban to negotiate. But they refuse to negotiate as long as U.S. troops are in the country. So we need to have some other honest broker, whether it's the United Nations or somebody else, take charge of negotiations, allowing U.S. troops to get out of the country and the different forces in Afghanistan to sit down around a table with proper mediation to have a peace agreement.
All right. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. Nicholas J. Davies.